Hello and welcome to Project Noon, a platform dedicated to exploring Hindu-Muslim dialogue. We're joined again today with Professor Arvind Sharma. Previously, of course, we had the professor to discuss the need for religious literacy and Hindu-Muslim dialogue, the common pitfalls that one encounters, and the prospects for genuine understanding between our communities and our traditions. To continue the series of conversations with the professor, Professor, my question to you is one of history, and because history is apparently central to Hindu-Muslim dialogue, and the question of history and the historical encounter between our traditions. And so we find two kinds of examples in history. We have an exemplary encounters, and we have some salutary encounters. We have both the kind of cases. And just to set things off, of course, in the earliest encounter, we have Al-Biruni's contribution as well. Al-Biruni's study of India and Indic traditions, which, as you mentioned, one place that it pioneered, or it was a forerunner of the phenomenological method of studying another tradition. Can we begin with that perspective, Professor?
Well, I mean, okay. There's a slight problem here in the sense that you have the historical method.
Right.
And that was our original question about the relationship between the two communities being at its heart historical. And then there's the phenomenological method, which moves away from history,
Of course.
It does not go into the question of origins and so on. But we can address both the issues. And of course, I do find Al-Biruni's work conforming to our norms of the phenomenological method we have now. And he himself says it very clearly in his book, that his purpose in writing that book is to enable a dialogue with the Hindus on their own terms.
Right.
And so that we might put in the exemplary category, although what was happening along with him, with Mahmud of Ghazna, may go into the salutary category. Yeah.
Right.
But to come back to your root question about the history and the history being at the core of it, this is true. In a sense, history is at the root of it. The interesting observation here is by a Muslim scholar whose name escapes me at the moment, who pointed out that because the differences between the Hindus and Muslims are historical rather than theological, it might be easier to deal with them. That is to say, the Hindus are not mentioned in the Quran, at least directly.
Right.
But the Jews are, and the Christians are. So that you have the revealed word regarding your relationships with these communities. Whereas the differences with the Hindus, you can argue, are essentially historical. And according to this scholar's view, it would be harder to deal with the theological differences than with historical ones, because he felt that historical differences could be negotiated. The way in which theology could impinge on history in a positive way would probably be by consideration of, for instance, whether the Hindus are a people of a book or not. Now, they are not mentioned specifically, but they are not excluded either.
Right.
So you have this gray area to negotiate. I found that observation very interesting. But of course, dealing with the historical issue in itself would be difficult because it raises the question of perceptions. What is your view on this?
Right.
I take the cue from there to move forward. Yeah.
Right. No, I think the point about theology, the issue of the differences in theology would be more essential, and historical encounters, of course, are accidental from that point of view. History needn't have been the way it has been. So I think that there's some genuine progress that can be made with that perspective. We needn't hold on to the accidents of history. And there is, of course, that ambivalence, theologically speaking, within Islam, of course, in the sense that on the one hand, it mentions that every community has received a message from God. But then the Quran also says that some people, some have been mentioned by name, but most of these other communities have not been mentioned by name in the Quran.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
So in a sense, it is up to us to whether we take whether we understand it in a narrow sense, that we will accept only those who have been named
Right.
as people with a book, as opposed to the more charitable approach that since all are not mentioned,
Right.
then those texts which are valued by the people as revelations should be acceptable.
Right.
It's interesting on this point that in medieval times, there is evidence, especially at the hand of Jain scholars, that they were using the word Veda to include all revelation, not just the text of the Vedas. Yeah. So in this way, the category could be extended from both sides, from the Muslim side and from the Hindu side. And a common ground can then emerge in which both sides accept the revelatory character of the text.
Right. Of course. And I think there's also a very interesting parallel between the nature of revelation perceived in both of these traditions, of course, where in one sense, the uncreated nature, as we say in Muslim theology of the Quran, the eternal nature, the nitya of the Vedas, is something, is a quality ascribed to revelation in general.
That's a very interesting point. Of course, I mean, if we move any further with that, we have the problem that the text on the Hindu side is considered not only nitya, but also a paurushaya.
Right.
The work of any author, either human or divine.
Of course.
So we get into that obstacle if we follow the course of Vedanta. But if we follow the course of the Nyaya school, then it does consider, the Nyaya school does consider God as the author of the Vedas.
Right.
Yes, so we could have a parallel. Yeah. See, the interesting thing I find in the context of the Hindu-Muslim relations is the plastic nature. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there are so many possibilities which emerge when you review the nature of the relationship, that the future course of the interaction of the communities could take any of those courses. I'll give you a simple example. Suppose the partition of India had not occurred.
Right.
The whole atmosphere in which we are discussing this issue
Right.
would have been different.
Of course.
We would be talking more about Darashiko, and people like that.
Right.
And at the moment, there's a kind of an elephant in the room of, what's going on in the country and the friction and the tensions. That wouldn't be there.
Right.
And the periods of accommodation would stand out in higher relief in our imagination, between the two communities.
Right.
So I really want to emphasize that plastic, we tend to become a bit historicist when we think about these relationships, in the sense that there is this kind of predetermination of some kind, that it's either positive or negative, and it can only go in that direction. That really is plastic.
Right.
And so in that case, the responsibility of the people who are representing these traditions and then communicating with each other becomes greater than we would normally assume it to be. Because they are actually shaping the relationship as they discuss it. Because of its plastic nature.
Right. Of course.
Yeah. So I think that gives a certain, that creates a different kind of atmosphere in which these issues could be examined and probed.
Right. And I think the entire, as you mentioned, the entire dynamic would be different if there was no partition in the first place.
Absolutely.
Because the exclusionary way of defining oneself as opposed to the other would of course be highly more attenuated if there was no such physical boundary even between these land masses.
Yeah, exactly. Let me share with you a kind of a fantasy which might indicate to us what possibilities there are. So, as you know, there are communities in India, I think especially in the area of Rajputana and Gujarat, where in the same family, and I think this is the case of Muslim communities, they have both an apparently Hindu name and an apparently Muslim name.
Right.
Now, this is an amazing thing, if we think about it a bit. What this tells us is that the person is wanting to retain both the identities, although placed in one, solidly placed in one, religiously. If you might make a distinction culturally, in a sense, he wants to retain both the identities. Now, this leads to a scenario in which, if there was peace between these two religions, and say also include Christianity, then an average person in India, especially a literate person who has studied these traditions, might have had three names. If the person is a Hindu, actually at the moment, irrespective of whether he's a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian, an apparently Hindu-sounding name, a Muslim-sounding name, and a Christian-sounding name. And depending on which community he was engaging, he would use the relevant name. Of course, here includes she.
Right.
So that's a totally different scenario from what we have now.
Right.
In which people have different persona, not in a negative sense. And so suppose there is a person in UP who is interested in Christian theology, interested in Urdu Shairi, and has a background in Sanskrit studies. Right? So when he's going to a mushaira, participating in one, he has this some Arabic or Persian name. When he's debating, discussing matters with the theologians, he has some kind of a Western name. And when he's studying his own scriptures, in this case, he does it with his Hindu name.
Right.
So this kind of, I mean, we already have that in the tradition of the takhallus. So Hindu poets freely, use apparently Islamic sounding
pen names. Right.
So this could expand.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned this in one of your essays, Professor, that one of the problems with I mean, the very notion of religious identity itself is a very modern notion.
Yes.
And the identity in a very strict and exclusivist sense is one of the products or fruits of European colonialism, in modernity. And of course, with all the surveys and statistics, trying to study a population or a group or categorize a population in a certain way to then be able to administer them more effectively. These identities were framed. But I mean, perhaps in a pre-modern setting, this would not have been the case necessarily.
That is quite possible. Certainly on the Indian side, but maybe with some limitations on the Western side, because the exclusive religious identity in Christianity is emphasized, probably also in Islam, and to a certain extent in Judaism. But which this leads me to the direction in which our discussion is going is very interesting, because once we accept the plasticity of the relationship, we move next to discussing questions of identity and the plasticity of that identity.
Right.
This is what you are pointing to, right? Now, I know that in the early period of the emergence of Christianity, and I believe Paul illustrates this case very well, you could be both a Jew and a Christian for a century or two. Now, my question is there any such example from Islamic history?
Right. Well, just to just to represent what certain modern scholarship on the life of the Prophet is talking about. For example, the author, I'm forgetting his name again. I actually had a conversation with him for our Project Noon. Muhammad, Prophet of Peace is the name of the book. I'm forgetting his name. He's a historian. Sorry, I'll just put the name again in the link if possible. But I mean, he's one example. But this is also a view which is shared by Fred Donner, another prominent name in the field. That the early, instead of very reified identities in terms of Muslim versus Christian and Jew, the initial idea of the initial Quranic idea and at the time of the life of the Prophet was of a community of believers, which included like an Abrahamic family, and this they support using the earliest source material, which is the Quranic text itself, to the picture that emerges from the text of the Quran. But then, of course, they say that later on, when it became an empire and it expanded, these identities got solidified and they were made in that sense. But initially, there seems to be this idea of a community of believers who could be either a Jew or a Muslim or Christian, and they all belong to one ummah. For example, even if you consider the Constitution of Medina, which the Prophet
Yes.
made in the early period,
I was thinking about that. Yes.
right? Even in that,
Yeah.
we find the term ummah used for this community, this group, even which included Jews who were
Yeah.
not believers at that point.
Yeah. And I believe there is also a hadith in which the Prophet says that so long as the people accept that there is one God, they can be part of the community.
Right.
It did not have the second rider that Muhammad is the Prophet.
Right. There's a verse of the Quran, of course, Surah 2, verse 62.
This is in the
Right.
Quran?
Right. I mean, which says that, the Jews, the Christians, the Sabians, and anyone apart from these, anyone who believes in God in the last day shall
Yeah.
have salvation in the afterlife. So it doesn't mention prophecy.
I see. Okay. Okay, very good. Actually, I read it in a piece by Professor Ayub.
Right.
And he, I think, quoted it as a hadith, though I cannot be sure at the moment.
Right.
But the point is very well taken, that one could, in a sense, be a part of a Brahmanic community, just as you could be a part of the Dharmic community in India. And whether you are a Sanatani or whether a Buddhist or a Jain or a Sikh, becomes a secondary matter. And this is very interesting. I found something in Islam very fascinating, which is that who is a Muslim can be easily determined in a legal sense, but it remains totally indeterminate in a theological sense till the day of judgment.
Of course. Right. I mean, it would be very presumptuous of anyone to say that I am a Muslim.
I am a Muslim, right.
Right.
Yeah, and isn't that one of the questions on which Rabia said
Right.
to her suitors?
Right.
That if you would answer these questions, I might consider your offer.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course.
So there also you get this some room for taking a gentler view of one's identity.
Right. And I think, as a matter of prudence, it seemed necessary at some point to establish certain formal distinctions between who's a Muslim and a non-Muslim for legal matters, for example, such as inheritance and, for example, the dietary laws, which other different communities have different kind of customs. So for those matters, it seemed prudent to have a distinction between us versus other community. But of course, metaphysically, this was always maintained that even someone who's outwardly a Muslim cannot claim that his heart is submitting to God. Only God knows the reality of your submission. And someone who's outwardly a non-Muslim, one has no right to say about them that they are not submitting to God or they are not. The category of kufr, again, is something that we have no right to apply to anyone. I mean, except in a purely legal and informal sense, but not in a theological or metaphysical sense.
Yes. So we do have some evidence of a malleable religious identity.
Right.
Is that the right word? Or a plastic religious identity?
Right.
Coming back to that. Yeah.
Fluid, plastic. Right.
In these situations. And so we have some example of that in Christianity, which is very interesting, which I found very interesting when I learned about it. And then we have now some from Islam, early phase. And of course, there are many examples of that from the Indic side.
Mm.
And then we also have it in China. And we have it in Japan.
Right. And I mean, just to build on one point which you mentioned previously, Professor, you were saying that this is something, this religious identity is something we are, even presently, it is something we are constructing or adding to and contributing to towards building, even through our present discussions and through our present rethinking and visualizing these ideas in the modern world. We are recreating these things again. Right.
That idea was slightly different from what we're discussing now.
Right.
What I was saying there was that because the relationship between Hindus and Muslims is not set in stone,
right,
but that its history reveals various possibilities, and these possibilities cannot be foreclosed arbitrarily, given the dynamism of history. So it is clear that the way we are discussing this issue is itself shaping the kind of possibility we are going to manifest.
Of course. Right.
Yeah. This, of course, applies to the other idea also, the allied idea that if religious identity is plastic, then and maybe what the task of engaged scholarship in this field is to bring this dimension of religious identity to the fore, to free us from the idea that, well, I'm a Muslim, therefore this can't be done and all, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a Jew, or I'm a Hindu, or a Buddhist, or whatever. Premature closure of possibility.
And I think and this is again a point which S. Radhakrishnan also talks about, that a authentic tradition has this possibility within itself of rethinking and visualizing or giving new life to old forms, as it were.
Yes. The two interesting comments which come to mind, of possible interest,
right,
which come to mind. One is the concept called reconception.
Right.
It belongs to a well-known scholar in the field whose name escapes me at the moment. But he basically argued that every tradition in the modern world is having to reconceive itself after its encounter with the other traditions. So it gives a formal status to what we were discussing.
Right.
Each tradition is reconciling itself. And the second point about this remark by Professor Radhakrishnan leads to a broader point that every religious tradition, by very virtue of the fact that it's a living religious tradition, possesses a quality which exceeds its contents. If that was not the case, no change would be possible.
Right.
And we know that all religions have changed over time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So if this is the nature of the tradition itself, we can never be sure what it's not going to produce or is going to produce in the future. The past, the track record, can give us some, we judge things by what they have been in the past. So that may give us some idea of what things might be in the future, but it can never determine the future or foreclose it.
Of course.
In any direction. So by the very nature, the very fact that they are great religious traditions, they are great because they have been able to deal with the challenges and retain their basic identity.
Right. I mean, I think this is, I mean, just to tie again back to the idea of religious identity. Of course, this is the most difficult question to answer. What is
Yeah.
Hinduism?
Yeah.
What is Hinduism?
Well, I mean, the question has to be modified a bit. If we are talking of identity, we don't have to ask the question,
Right.
what is Hinduism? We have to ask the question, who is a Hindu?
Right. Of course.
Right?
Right. Right.
Similarly, in the case of Islam and also, who is a Muslim? Who is a Christian?
Right.
And then from that, you can build about Christianity, Islam, and whatever. So it's very interesting that in the case of in the case of the Hindu identity, the actual criterion for being a Hindu is, in a sense, national and geographical, rather than creedal. I'm using the word advisedly, national and geographical, and I'll explain them in a minute, the sense in which I'm using them, rather than creedal. So the issue came to a head when the government of India wanted to consolidate Hindu law. So they produced the Hindu Marriage Act. So the question was, who are the people to whom it applies? So we have to define who is a Hindu.
Right.
So if you look at the provision of who is a Hindu closely, you will find that they use two levels to define a Hindu. A Hindu is a person who belongs to a category either A or B. Category A, who is an Indian citizen, but is not a Muslim, Christian, Zoroastrian, or Jew. So this is definition by negation.
Right.
The category B, who is not an Indian citizen, but is a Hindu by religion. So what they are saying is that if you are an Indian, you are presumed to be a Hindu unless it is shown that you are not, by being a Muslim, Christian, Zoroastrian, or Jew. If you are a non-Indian, you are presumed to be a non-Hindu until you claim to be one. So by national, I meant the category A. By geographical, I meant category B, whether you are in India or out of India, or in terms of Indian citizenship there.
That's right.
And now, how would you define a Muslim?
I think, I mean, that is equally difficult to define, I think so. I mean, of course, from a theological angle, we have certain definitions. In the sense that, for example, Ghazali would define a Muslim in his famous text on the boundaries of theological tolerance in Islam.
He has a book like that?
It's called. I mean, that's the title of the English translation by Sherman Jackson, but of course the title in Arabic is Faisal al-Tafriqa bain al-Islam wa Zandiqa, the criterion to distinguish between in true belief and heresy. That's the actual title. But it's a very pluralistic book in the sense of intra-Muslim pluralism. He doesn't aim to talk about other communities, but he does mention them. And he's about them also. He has very charitable views. But I mean, just to talk about how he defines a Muslim, his idea is that anyone who says that they believe in God and the Prophet is a Muslim. So whatever the details of their creed,
yes,
those are all secondary. Right. I mean, this is a theological definition, also a very legal definition, but on the metaphysical level, of course, that's a different question entirely. Who's a Muslim and who's not a Muslim?
Right, right.
But I mean, there's another related book, Professor. I don't know, you might be aware of this, a book which recently came out in 2018, I think, by Shahab Ahmed. What is Islam? Of Harvard University. He of course passed away. But it's a 600-page book, and it doesn't end up with any answer. It tries to look at how this question has been answered in religious studies. For example, there's one answer to it: Islam is a religion, and then there's one answer: Islam is law, and Islam is culture. So all of these perspectives do not encompass the reality of what we find happening on the ground in history. So Islam is actually text-based, yes. So I mean, there's a central text to it, but then of course there are also certain practices which are extra-textual and which are formed through people's interaction with other communities and through other traditions which have not been preserved in text, but through generation to generation, as it happens in Sufi orders, for example. So there are, I mean, just to put it in that sense, that it is also, I feel, a very difficult question to define in that sense. With any
what was the
precision.
title of the book again? What was the title of the book?
What is Islam? The importance of being Islamic, subtitle.
Yeah. What is Islam? Yeah. I guess if we try to answer the question, what is Christianity, we will have a similar problem.
Right.
And what is Judaism, we will have a similar problem.
Right.
But who is a Jew and who is a Christian might be easier to answer. You know?
Right.
And who is a Muslim. This brings us to a very interesting point in the sociology of religion. But I believe there's a German scholar, his name could be Simmel, who has distinguished between two kinds of religions. Let me give them the names of communitarian religion and associational religion. So for him, a communitarian religion is one in which the community comes first. And the beliefs and practices of that community constitute its religion, are an expression of its togetherness.
Right.
The community comes first, and then you have the beliefs and the practices, and that becomes the religion. The other kind is the associational, in which you first have a set of doctrines and practices, and a community coalesces around them. This he calls association, or this we may call association. Now the point then is that in his discussion of the topic, he gives primal religions as the primary example of the first kind. And Christian sects typically as examples of the second kind. So it's dealing with small-scale societies, sort of, right? But if we enlarge the canvas, then we can say that the Abrahamic religions are of the associational type. Hinduism is the communitarian type. You might regard it as the largest surviving primal religion. So this then throws some light on the way we try to identify who is a Hindu. Not with the helps of beliefs and practices, but by other criteria, because Hinduism is the sum total of the beliefs and practices of the Hindus.
Right. I mean, that is actually the exact conclusion which Shahab Ahmed makes about Islam.
Really?
Right.
But that's very interesting because there is a
Right.
point of convergence here.
Right.
And then the association, of course, is obvious. Yeah?
Right. Right.
Yeah, you have the creed in Islam or in Christianity and so on. But if he has come to the same conclusion, then I think there is less difference between the two. Then we might be willing to concede, which might see, we will imagine at the beginning that they would be very different.
Right.
But if at the end of his, magisterial work, apparently, it comes to that conclusion, then that's very interesting.
Right. Right.
Because it shows the tentative nature of this distinction.
Hmm.
But this I use to explain to the class how there is no universal belief in Hinduism.
Right.
There are widespread beliefs, and that it is the wrong thing to look for. If you say there must be some unifying single belief.
Right. I mean, just one, instant question that comes to mind, Professor. How do we fit this view with the classical distinction that was made between Gnostic and Astic?
Yes. So the Gnostic and Astic is heterodox and non-orthodox, or rather orthodox and non-orthodox. So now here's a very interesting question. What is the point of the distinction? The distinction turns on whether you accept Vedic authority or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So now you find that there are degrees in the acceptance of Vedic authorities. Mimamsa and Vedanta are most committed to it. Nyaya, Vaisheshik, Sankhya and Yoga formally accept it, but do their own.
Right.
And the Nastikas reject it. Yeah. But the commentary on the text, which describes the Hindu systems and discusses Astika and Nastika, ultimately comes to the conclusion that the only basis of this distinction must be whether you believe in an afterlife or not. That is, these things, Jains, Buddhists, Hindus, and Hindu schools so close together that he ultimately thought only the Charvakas. But within Hinduism, you can always say that my view, this is my view, and I belong to the community.
Right.
What is Vedic with the passage of time? What is Vedic came to be interpreted as whatever is consistent with the Vedic. So, even in the case of the Nastikas, efforts were made to prove that their views are represented in the Vedas.
Right.
So there is the distinction, and it is important philosophically, for the debate. But there is also the underlying sentiment that the community in which this debate is being carried out is the same. That is, the universe of discourse is the same. So Irfan Habib has a very nice statement when he discusses the Bistani Mazahib. And he points out that the real issue between the Islamic and the Indic traditions was that they were not participating in the same realm of discourse. Who is a true Brahman? Who achieves moksha? These are issues on which both Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, materialists, they could all debate. But these made no sense in the Abrahamic worldview,
Right.
And that this was the real basis of the distinction. And I think it's a very profound point. Because if you enter the same realm of discourse, then in a sense, you are the same community. And your discussion is intra-communal. You are debating who is a true Hindu or a true Muslim. I mean, I'm told by my friend, Arun Shori, that Munir Commission, which was appointed in Pakistan, could never resolve the issue who is a Muslim. Everybody had a different kind of a detailed, detail about it.
Right. And of course, I mean, there's no central authority either when it comes to defining who ultimately is regarded as a Muslim and who's not a Muslim.
But this is an interesting parallel with Hinduism because there is no central authority.
Right, of course.
So it's your claim.
Right.
But in Islam, I thought there was, first of all, there was the caliphate. So there is greater provision for a central authority. Am I right?
Well, I mean, I don't know the historical details of the caliphate, of course, but of course, in principle, at least, the caliph would also be subject to the law of God. And so the caliph would, of course, be more of an executioner. And the judiciary would be the scholars of the law, the jurists, and those who study fiqh and theologians. So they would be the main determiners of what is classed as God's law and God's intent.
Yeah.
I mean, at least in principle, but of course, where power goes, there goes, people's opinions, and people. You have scholars who modify their opinions for the sake of political expediency.
The conclusion which seems to emerge from our discussion is that, irrespective of the tradition, there seems to be enough pluralism within each tradition to allow for pluralism in the interaction among them.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
Yeah. And the issue of religious identity could similarly be a negotiable one almost. Or certainly a malleable one.
Right.
And of course, I mean, if you peg your identity at the Abrahamic religions, then you get a different kind of a consequence. If you peg your identity in terms of one of the Abrahamic religions, you get a different kind of outcome.
Well, I mean, this is, sorry to interject over here, but I mean, this seems really fascinating because the Quran actually critiques the other people of the book for being exclusivist about their own traditions. For example, it says that they say that if you're a Christian, then God will save you in the afterlife, and others say that if you're a Jew, then you'll be saved. But this kind of attitude, of course, is something the Quran doesn't encourage. But I mean, and then it says that but only if you submit yourself to God. Islam is a verb, and more than a noun.
Noun, yes.
I brought that up actually to just say that the very idea of situating Islam as an Abrahamic religion would seem to be a narrowing down of Islam from an Islamic point of view itself. Because, of course, Islam recognizes Abraham, Moses, and Jesus as prophets. But then it also says in the Quran that there are many more prophets, there are numerous prophets. And then believers are supposed to say that we make no distinction between any of the prophets. So just to restrict yourself to Abrahamic traditions would again
but you
be
see, from that point of view, even in Christianity, you have the famous statement in the New Testament about, in my Father's house there are other mansions.
Right.
And there are other sheep. I have other sheep which do not belong to this flock. These are statements by, I think, Jesus. And in Judaism, of course, there is a very interesting discussion in the Torah as to whether non-Jews can enter heaven. And then the discussion is that the text says the righteous shall enter heaven. It does not say the Jew shall enter heaven. And a non-Jew can also be righteous. Therefore, non-Jews can also enter hell.
Right.
So in all the three traditions, we have discussed, there is room for arguing, maintaining that the other is not necessarily perceived in opposition, but in apposition.
Right.
And once you have that, you have the community of discourse, the universe of discourse.
Right.
So the reservation I was having was that typically these attitudes emerge in a community in its early phase. This kind of openness. And once it becomes established and acquires power and things like that, they harden. I don't know how valid a generalization this is, but the thought comes to mind that the historical moment may be a significant thing. But of course, from that point of view, we are in a very interesting moment in history because all the religions are getting exposed to each other.
Right.
In a way which has probably not happened, earlier. So it is a new moment.
Right.
And so it may have that magical potential of celebrating certain openness.